Yeah, I have two related questions, if that's okay. First, I'll try to articulate as best I can. I appreciate Mr. Underwood's point that we don't want to be deferring projects. You don't want to dig yourself into a hole of unfunded projects and needs in the transportation context. And we have a $2.03 million paving budget for this year that we have now augmented with, or proposing to augment with another 386,000, which is leveraged with a state match to essentially bring us to a 2.73 or 2.7 or so million dollar paving budget for this year. So we've been able to, through leveraging this grant, if we approve this appropriations ordinance, move from about 2 million to 2.7 million. But because that 386,000 could be used for any number of things, including pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure projects, by using it to augment the paving budget, that's a trade-off that we are choosing to make, is it not, that could be characterized as choosing to defer on bicycle and pedestrian projects, which also have a long list of unfunded projects. So I'm not pretending these are easy choices, but because the windfall from a mild winter could be used for any number of things, I guess, is it not true that choosing to place it in one area of transportation, by definition, defers projects in another? Does that make sense? Sorry.
To whom are you directing the question,
Mr. Underwood or Mr. Wason?
I guess I'll jump in here first. I think at the core of the question, Matt, the answer is yes. But at the same time, I think we need to really, I think I step back and look at it from a balanced approach to how we expend our funds across the board. By my calculations from city council sidewalk fund, from the dollars allocated in the public works budget to the planning and transportation's use of the 454 funds, we're going to do about 1.335 million this year in other forms of transportation improvement projects. So that's sidewalks, multimodal, et cetera. So, it's a balance thing for me. And of course we want to support and continue to invest in those projects. The other thing to me, as the public works director who oversees 7 different budgets and has a lot of fluctuation at the street department budget year after year, and this is where I alluded to being most proud of some of our efforts earlier, is we've got a lot of infrastructure that we have to take care of on an operational basis. So we have, I think it's somewhere around 331 lane miles of pavement that we need to maintain. So in the overall balance and scheme of things, to knock out a project of this size and scope for pavement maintenance, it's not choosing to not invest in other forms of multimodal improvements. We have an obligation to continue to maintain our road network and our pavement. And I'll admit, in a very proud way, I think a lot of cities would be envious of our overall PCI rating at 63 or so for our whole network. You want to be at 70 to 75 so that you can always continue to maintain with, your annual budget allocations. But, I don't think it's a matter of one or the other. I think it's a matter of both.
Thank you. And the related question for Mr. Copper, if that's okay, Council President Bolin.
Yes, please continue.
And this was fleshed out in relatively good detail, I think, in written questions and the Transportation Committee meeting. But thinking about how the transportation plan does call for protected bike lanes on College Mall Road, on this stretch of College Mall Road, and how ideally I would love to see that when we maintain or improve roads that we're bringing them into alignment with our transportation plan. But I understand that the administration thinks that will take some more study and or time, and that this paving project won't preclude that. Getting to the question for which that context I think was necessary, is that the transportation plan says, things like funding availability and other factors might dictate that we can't install the planned facility at the time of a maintenance project, but it says that it might require a different facility to be installed. So for the example given on page 39 of the transportation plan is a conventional bike lane may be added on a street, which shows a higher level facility. That's basically the exact situation we have here. And I wanted to know if there was, I feel like a final if there was a final resolution on this, I didn't see it, which is, could we, within the existing curb cuts and all the rest, or curb widths, street widths, narrow lanes and fit conventional bike lanes, even knowing that that isn't matching what the transportation plan calls for at this point? And what were your thoughts on that, Mr. Copper?
Can he be unmuted, please? There you go, Mr. Copper.
Thank you. And I'll have to apologize in advance. My internet was going out in the middle of your question.
It's okay. I rambled.
But I think I caught the end of basically, is it feasible to not implement the full transportation plan recommendation of protected bike lanes, but instead do kind of an incremental improvement of painted bike lanes on the street? Is that the question?
Yes. Like, would there be space to accomplish that without reducing lanes at this point?
Yes. So for the majority of the street, the existing road is wide enough that we can keep all the same number and configuration of motor vehicle lanes, simply make them a little bit narrower, but still within our standards, and install a traditional painted bicycle lane on the street. Not for the entire length of it. The northern portion in particular is narrower. The width changes quite a bit on that street. And I also have to caveat it that, we haven't done a detailed design effort on the street yet. Not that would take a terribly long time. We've done kind of initial analysis and believe it's feasible for the majority, but we haven't dug fully into the details yet.
And just related, can you, maybe not commit to something at this point because you're still in the design phases, but is this something that Planning and Transportation and Public Works are looking seriously at as an option when this is repaved and restriped?
Yeah, we are looking at that. We're going to look further. When you're talking about a change of moving stripes over a few feet, that's much easier to accomplish in coordination with the resurfacing. So we will be looking at that with the resurfacing. But yeah, no decisions have been made.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any more second round questions from people who have not yet asked a question? Because I have some. Okay, seeing none, I'll take a crack at it. I think that what I was trying to get at, and even then I wasn't quite sure of it when I was asking about the paving list, is, so I see a couple hundred records of the paving list this year, and the highest rated PCI that needs to be repaired is 63, the lowest is 8. The majority of them seem to be below the 50% that College Mall Road is at. I guess my question is, I can't see the 2019 equivalent to this list. I don't know. How will there be a list similar to this next year, Mr. Wason? Will there be a bunch of roads that are like in the 20 or 30 PCI range? And if so, why? Like if we're trying to get to 75, do you see what I'm saying? Like, I don't quite get.
Sure. No, absolutely. Yeah. If I can just jump in right here. It's a matter of traffic volumes. It's a matter of small residential streets. There may be a very small residential street that 10 cars use a day that might be at a 20 or 25. That wouldn't be as high of a priority as another 50 in an area that gets 20,000 cars a day. So it's all about, it's kind of that approach. We don't have traffic counts for every single city street we have. But what we do is try to, recognize where people are utilizing the road network the most, where the investments, for lack of better terms, gets the most bang for your buck. So that it's not as
sure, but I mean, but I'm seeing here arterials rated at below 50. There are 40, like arterials is 41
in certain sections.
Yeah, I mean, how many more arterials will be on next year's list that are below 50?
I would hope most all of them. And it's all about the sections and how far of a section you would be paving in any given project. So there may be smaller sections of an arterial that are at an 80 or a 90, and then there's a smaller, quarter mile or half mile section that's at a 40 or a 50. So, it's not just as there's all sorts of factors taken into consideration when we go through our paving list. It's not simply paving condition index numbers.
Okay. I guess the other question I have is sort of a follow-up on what's been asked already. But it does seem to me that the impulse when it came time to take advantage of extra money was to pave a street rather than to build more non-car infrastructure. That sort of still appears to be the, I mean, I hear what you say about 330 lane miles or so that you have to make sure it stays in condition. And I can only imagine it's a difficult task to decide what gets attention and what doesn't. It's just that, as has been said, I mean, for years we've lamented that we only have $300,000 a year or so to get more sidewalks built.
That's not that's through the council sidewalk committee. I hate to interrupt
Right.
you. That's only through the council,
please.
councils. We are going to dedicate $1.335 million in the 2020 budget to different types of multimodal improvements, and that's not including the bicentennial bond improvements. That's not, so that $1.335 million is in the 2020 budget for street department, for planning and transportation, and for the council sidewalk committee to improve sidewalks and multimodal and do those types of investments. So it's much more than that. I just want to make that clear.
I mean, and that's encouraging. Okay, it's much more than that. It is, however, still literally when you add up the extra $700,000 that's being added through this appropriation ordinance, that's double. The budget we're spending just on milling, repaving is double the amount we're spending on bike ped infrastructure. So it's a matter of priorities. That's all.
Well, but I would also say that it's a matter of priority for the community as a whole. Outside of leafing customer service complaints, I would probably venture to guess, and Joe, correct me here if I'm wrong, the number one customer service related call we get outside of leafing at the street department is going to be about potholes, about pavement condition throughout the whole entire network. So that is a very, very important thing that we continue to invest in year after year and do so to, keep those ratings up. For all
if I can interrupt here for a second.
Yes, please.
Well, if I can just say, I mean, what you say, I acknowledge it, but these are people are complaining about things that already exist. You're not going to, by default, you're not going to get people complaining about a bike path that needs updating when it doesn't exist yet, or that they demand a new bike path before. I mean, when you have a pothole somewhere, somebody's going to call it in because it already exists and they've been using it. You can't use a bike path that doesn't exist or a sidewalk that doesn't exist. What do you say to that?
I fully support increasing our investments there, but we also need to recognize that those will also have an ongoing cost and create ongoing maintenance costs. Hang on, I need to stop and ask my wife to bring down my charger for the computer. April, can you bring my charger down, please?
Too.
Thank you.
I'm with you. All right. Are there any other questions from members before we go to motions? I see none. Councilmember Flaherty.
Sorry, one more. And I know I'm not trying to get into debate. I am curious to hear what anyone from the administration would like to say about this kind of fundamental tension between the fact that we have a climate crisis and a 27% emissions in our city. 27% of emissions come from greenhouse gases from transportation, with vehicle miles traveled increasing over the last decade. And the need to drastically change that system. The tension between that and the customer service model of streets, where try to kind of keep folks happy with the condition of the street. These are really hard choices. I get it, and it's all unfunded. And we all wish we had more money to do all these things. I guess I just haven't heard that mentioned at all, but it's in the executive summary and opening of our transportation plan that the IPCC in its 1.5 degree report in 2018 has called for all governments, including ours, to drastically take action. And that should be a guiding principle in our transportation system. And I guess I'd be curious to hear anyone's perspective from the administration on how we balance that tension. I don't know. It's a very high level question, obviously, but I'd be curious to hear anyone's perspective. Thank you.
Is Alex still on the call? No,
Mr.
I don't think Mr. Crowley is.
No, he's not here.
That is a very high level question, Matt, and that's something that we're, looking at with all of our different plans: our transportation demand management plan, the transportation plan, the mayor's executive task force of department heads that are looking at climate change. I don't have a great answer for you there, but it is certainly something we consider when making investments, and when we invest in, whether it's bike ped, whether it's all the different things. But that's a whole level of conversation. But at the same time, I know the expectation of the community for us as the Public Works Department is that we continue to maintain our roadways and our road network.
Thank you.
Okay, at this point, I would like to make a motion and then explain it. I'd like to move that we recommit Appropriation Ordinance 2002 to the Transportation Committee. I need a
Mr.
second.
President?
Yes.
Mr. President, may I suggest we go to the public first, since is this the noticed public hearing on this matter?
Well, the other issue is that there's also an amendment on the table. And
it's not on the table yet, as far as I know.
Well, there's an amendment on the agenda that's been advertised. I don't mind going to the public for it, but I will be making a motion to recommit. So
can I comment?
Mr. Wason?
So I appreciate that, Mr. Councilmember Volan. I would respectfully request that we do support this evening. We would like to get this project moving. We would like to continue with all of the, I don't have the deadline in front of me, but for us
Point
to
of
get
order.
Mr. Wason, the motion's not on the table yet. Yeah.
It's not having been seconded, so
right.
That's
the
what I was
motion's
trying
not
to
actually on the
say.
table.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Wason, you will have a chance to speak.
Okay, thank you.
We will address this in a minute. Let's go to the public. Before we take up motions and amendments, let's go to the public for comment on Appropriation Ordinance 2002. Is there anyone, this represents the official public meeting for this appropriation ordinance. And so there will also be an opportunity to speak on any amendments or motions. Is there any member of the public who would like to speak? I see people who have raised their hand. Mr. Lucas, would you please call on them?
Yeah, and before we get there, I don't know if the chair wants to explain to folks the procedures. I think the council previously has said that we will enable audio only for public commenters. I think a previous commenter was able to have video enabled and I hadn't noticed, but the process moving forward, just to avoid any issues with allowing the public to access the meeting, will be to enable audio only for public commenters, and then to disable that once you're done. So our first public commenter, I believe, is Jeff McKim, who should be ready to speak.
Mr. McKim, please go ahead. You'll have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I won't need anywhere near that. Thank you very much, Council. I appreciate Council Member Flaherty's comment pointing out that by not deferring paving projects, you are indeed deferring bicycle and pedestrian projects. Of course, that's true. By prioritizing anything, you're deprioritizing something else. But I would frame this not so much as roads versus bike infrastructure, but as prioritizing maintaining assets over creating new ones. I'm obviously not a transportation expert by a long shot, but I do attempt to keep up on the literature. And one point that's made constantly is that maintaining pavement infrastructure is critical, because if the condition of pavement gets below a certain point, the costs of repair and eventual replacement increase dramatically. I didn't have time in between hearing this discussion and making this comment to actually find some of the conditions versus cost charts, but I think you'd find them eye-opening. So in essence, by deferring pavement maintenance, you aren't just deferring the costs to another year, but you're increasing them substantially. And if deferred enough, you find yourself needing to replace the pavement and many times the cost. Defer new road construction to fund new bike ped infrastructure, please, yes. But don't defer the maintenance of existing pavement. It's going to be a fool's bargain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. McKim. Next up, Mr. Lucas.
Next up, we've got Mr. Greg Alexander, who should be ready to speak.
Mr. Alexander, you have 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Greg Alexander. Mr. Wason did just say that drivers are a major source of complaints for his department, and I'd just like to point that out, that's while we have spent the majority of public work dollars and the majority of transportation funds for about 60 years, we've spent that on cars. And so that really gets to the heart of it. The more money you spend on car infrastructure, the more drivers complain. And that's a fool's bargain. Anyways, I actually came here to speak about the Sayre Road and Morris Pike intersection. I've really avoided this particular speech because it's a little bit more technical. It's easy for me to say to even just policy body such as yourself can easily see it. There's no sidewalks, people are walking in the street, but this is going to be a little bit more complicated. I really regret that, but it's important. There's a NACDO guide for designing bikeways, and it is literally titled, "Don't Give Up at the Intersection." It's titled, "Don't Give Up at the Intersection." And this project, the fact that the intersection was included in the project at all is a huge sign that someone in planning and transportation is really trying hard to do a good job. But the actual design that's proposed, I don't know if it's been updated since then, but that's been posted on the website, is not the improvement that we need. To explain that, I'm going to have to use a concept called curb radius. That's the radius of a circle that would match the turn that the driver has to go through on the curb. And on downtown intersections, like a four-way stop, the curb radius is usually 10 to 20 feet, just to give a little context. On a freeway on-ramp, for example, it would be 250 feet. And that's a very effective way to control speed. Engineers literally have a table of curb radius versus speed. And it's very effective because a car simply can't make a tight turn at speed. It's impossible. And this intersection is a little bit complicated because it's not right angles. It's not two roads just meeting at a perfect plus sign. It's two of the turns are very wide turns where you only have to turn through about 60 degrees. And those turns, they are reducing the radius a little bit in the proposed design. They're reducing it to 70 feet for one of them and 90 feet for another. So that's not quite as big as a freeway on-ramp, but you've been through that intersection. It's still a very wide turn. People will take those turns at 30 or 40 miles an hour every time, all day long. And then there's two tighter turns where you have to turn through effectively about 120 degrees. It's not quite a U-turn, but it kind of feels like one. And the before is 50 feet and the after is 50 feet. So those are those slip lanes. Those are, there's no red light, there's no stop sign. Those are, high speed turns, and they're a 50-foot radius, and they're effectively unchanged by this new design. And those turns, people will take those at 20 or 30 miles an hour, and they will not yield to pedestrians. And even though it's only a 12-foot crossing, you're crossing traffic that will not stop, will not yield. And that's devastating for pedestrians. And the reason that it was engineered this way is that it was engineered under the old GPP, which prioritizes car capacity and then says pedestrian safety is also nice. Well, our new transportation plan says pedestrian safety is the primary driver of design and car capacity should take second place. It's a question of priorities. And I would argue that these turns, especially the slip lanes, could be re-implemented as like a 20-foot radius or even smaller radius turn. And that will slow drivers down. It really will. And you can still, with a 20-foot turn, it's amazing how much smaller the intersection gets. You can still have a short pedestrian crossing. Obviously, the engineers are not going to be crazy about this. A truck to make a tight turn around a 20-foot radius will have a hard time. He'll have to use up more of the intersection. But just for context, if you're at Kroger looking for parking and you get to the end of one aisle and you do a U-turn to go to the next aisle over in the parking lot at Kroger, that's about a 20-foot radius turn. And so we know that our cars can make 20-foot radius turns. Big work trucks can make 20-foot radius turns. UPS trucks even can make 20-foot radius turns. So it's not an impossible goal. It's a legitimate policy question. Do you want to revisit this design? Do you really think we can get the engineers to do a better job the second time around? You know, is it worth the resources? Those are open questions. I don't know. I just want you to know that the design as proposed will not improve the situation for pedestrians to an acceptable level. It won't even come close. People will still be going through those right turns without stopping at 20 to 40 miles an hour every single time. Thanks a bunch for your time.
Thank you. Mr. Lucas?
Next up, I believe we've got Dave Askins, who should be unmuted and ready to speak.
Mr. Askins, you'll have 5 minutes.
Can you hear me, Steve?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, first of all, I wanted to say I really appreciate the use of a supplemental packet that was posted today for tonight's meeting. As a journalist, it certainly makes it a lot easier to report on a legislative body's actions when the text of proposed amendment to an ordinance is provided in writing ahead of the meeting. And the same goes for the written questions from council members and the written answers from staff that were included in the supplemental packet as well. So thanks for that. It makes my work as a journalist easier, and it's also better for the public. So I want to focus on question number 7 in the supplemental packet. Question 7 says, what's up with the approximately $5 million announced at County Council on May 12th to come to local municipal units as, quote, supplemental lit distribution? And the written answer given by the city staff involves a 75% requirement for use on engineering, land acquisition, construction, resurfacing, et cetera, for road and street systems. But you know, when you look at the statute, it sure looks like the restriction that's described in the city's answer applies only to the 2016 special distribution, not the routine annual supplemental distribution that the question is asking about. And from Controller Jeff Underwood's remarks tonight, I think that is the correct understanding. So what Mr. Underwood described, I think, is the correct understanding, which is that supplemental distribution that the question asks about is that'll go to public safety on the one hand and general fund on the other, and it's not subject to any requirement that it be used for arterial road and street systems. So I conclude from that that the written answer in that packet is wrong. And the problem is that that wrong answer is now posted on the city's public website. So my suggestion would be that the council needs to think about some approach to making corrections to packets. If you regard the packet posting system as some kind of a civic newspaper, you know, there should be a correction policy. How do you handle that? Because I certainly didn't hear anybody say out loud tonight at the meeting yet, yeah, that answer was wrong. So from the public's perspective, the public record of that content, as far as anybody knows, yeah, question 7 got the correct answer. Now, maybe I'm just not understanding the facts of the matter or the answer, but I think that it's true that that answer is wrong. And I would suggest that it just needs to be addressed somehow. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Askins. Are there any other public comments, Mr. Lucas, or requests for public comment?
Not that I see, no.
Okay, let's come back to council. I'm going to, again, make my motion to recommit App Board 2002 to Transportation Committee to return on June 3rd.
Sorry, before we get too far away from public comment, I did want to note for the public that tonight served as the public hearing on this matter. A public hearing is required by statute on the appropriation ordinance. Should the council decide to postpone or not act tonight, we should make known when the council intends to act so that we don't have to republish notice in the newspaper.
Thank you.
Underwood, can add anything that I've missed?
I need a second before we can discuss this. Thank you. All right. Well, Mr. Lucas makes the point that I wanted to make that undergirds this motion. So first I want to apologize to everyone because this was sort of a complex oversight. When we were scheduling this, you know, the Transportation Committee should have had 2 regular sessions before I had to come back. It should have had until June 3rd. But because we allowed the public meeting that Mr. Lucas just described to be advertised for tonight, we had an obligation to discuss this tonight. And so the committee had to give up the legislation after one meeting. And as you can all hear from the discussion tonight, it was very complicated, and there's a lot of questions still. And I was the one who abstained in the committee vote last week, because while I'm sympathetic to, I'm sympathetic to both sides. I agree that we need to be focusing on bike ped infrastructure more. I also get that Public Works is feeling pressure to meet the construction season, and this is mostly money that was budgeted before. Nevertheless, you know, this is the principle behind the committee system, is that you know, tonight's unwieldy discussion is what happens when the committee doesn't have time to do its work. And so, because again, we advertised that for an appropriation ordinance, we have an obligation to advertise a public meeting, and we made the mistake, and I take blame for this, for allowing it to be advertised for tonight, which required, I mean, because we thought that this would not be controversial, and it turns out that there's controversy on at least a third of the proposal, and rather than create a new appropriation ordinance that could take a month to do, there's still an opportunity to resolve the questions and any amendments that might be necessary with an additional 2-week period. So yeah, we don't have anything scheduled for the 27th at the moment, for May 27th. So there's room in the schedule. It's not going to be particularly onerous on May 27th. And I think that the questions are, I mean, I don't feel comfortable voting on this tonight, and if I'm forced to, I'll vote no. But I'm hoping that instead we will postpone. Now, I will also say this, there's a question, Councilmember Rosenbarger has an amendment, and when I finally contemplated the amendment, I thought maybe it was more appropriate to divide the question than to amend as she did. But after extensive consultation with council staff, the parliamentarian, we've determined that division of the question is not debatable, and it is almost identical to the amendment. And that, you know, dividing the question was also something that I thought we should consider tonight, to permit people who don't agree with one portion of the ordinance to vote on that without voting against other parts of it. But that's not really feasible parliamentarily in this moment, and I could explain that more, but I would bore people to death. So with that, I'm happy to entertain questions about the motion. Councilmember Rallo.
Well, 2 questions, I think. One is, when will final action occur by the council so that staff knows a timetable, since you know, they're anticipating getting projects underway for the season, and they have a limited season. So I would, you know,
can I answer that first?
Is this days or is this weeks? No,
this is okay.
Go ahead.
Well, so today is May the 20th. This came forward on May the 6th and was referred to committee, which heard it on the 13th. Under normal committee procedures, the committee would have had until June 3rd to render its report. So I can't speak for the whole council as to when they make a decision, but this would simply restore the normal committee procedure. We had an obligation to discuss it tonight because, as I said, of the advertising requirement, we advertised it for May 20th. But my proposal would give the committee one more cycle, and they would have to report back by June 3rd.
So when would final action be by the whole council?
The council would have could have a third reading, in this case on June 3rd. That's up to the council to decide, but it would come back. It'd have to come back under normal circumstances. It would have had to come back by June 3rd. That's all I'm proposing with the motion.
Okay, and what questions are left unanswered?
I mean, I don't know that I can. If you couldn't tell from the discussion, I think you've answered your own question. Like, if you feel satisfied that you don't have any more questions, then I would suggest you not support the motion. But I think there are plenty.
No, what I'm asking is, can those questions be issued this evening and clarified so we don't have to go into another committee and then bring it back? I mean, if we can just attend to those questions tonight, we have staff, we have Mr. Underwood. What I understood in one of the last questions, I think, Councilmember Flaherty, was that the money appropriated targeted to maintenance doesn't preclude bike lanes. And so those bike lanes could come, after the paving occurs. And so there's no need to conflate whether this sacrifices bike lanes or not. So I'd like to know specific questions that you're wanting to remove this legislative item from this meeting this evening, which I anticipated voting for. Why it needs to go to committee and then back to council again for further questions.
Okay, well, on my screen, I have the 7-page document that represents the answers from the administration to the questions asked by the committee. And there's another apology. I mean, these are questions that should have been asked after first reading and not after the committee hearing. So that's also on me, at least. Nevertheless, we received the questions, I believe, Monday or Tuesday. We really appreciated them. That doesn't necessarily mean that they answer. I, for one, I've read it and I have a couple of questions, but in the flurry of questions about procedure, I haven't really had a chance to process them. Secondly, I would suggest that while this motion may be to recommit to committee, the normal procedure should be the committee should have had. We shouldn't have had to meet tonight. The committee should have had 2 meetings, and that we could also postpone to June 3rd without going back to committee. But I'm asking for more time to deliberate on this because I know of at least one question. I can't even remember it now because I'm busy trying to handle the procedural matter. So I'm sorry to be so vague. I, for one, don't feel comfortable voting on this tonight. It needed more time and we didn't have it.
I would appeal that we have a second round of questions to see if those matters could be resolved this evening.
I just don't think they can all be answered tonight, and I didn't want to extend the meeting any further.
Well, I don't even know what questions we're talking about right now. So if those questions could be described, and even in terms of vague ways, it would help me understand why to delay. So thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Are there other questions on the motion? Councilmember Sandberg.
Maybe I'm missing something too, but I'm not seeing where the controversy is. If there does need to be some correction made, some of the answers that were given, I read through that. I was fully prepared this evening to be supportive of this. So delaying this, I'm just perplexed as to what's going to be accomplished by kicking it back to a subquorum of 4 when the entire council is here to consider this tonight. Staff is here to answer any questions that have anybody concerned about the proper usage of this funding and its priority and its leveraging of perfectly good funding to be able to maintain the status of our project. I'm just clearly not seeing where the issues need to be fully further vetted by only 4 members of this duly elected body.
Okay, well, I can entertain a motion to simply go to a 3rd reading, but I would say that I will speak for myself and say that I am not satisfied yet, and I am not comfortable voting for this yet, and I want to be. If there is a majority that is, then the majority will prevail. But I would also say that while you are comfortable and you feel that you are ready to make a decision, I'm not. I think there are others who are not. And again, because of the way we advertise this meeting, it precluded the committee from having their normal course of work, which is why I propose that it go back to committee. I understand that it's something you don't agree with, but I would say that I'm not the only member who wants more time to understand the question fully. And I don't understand the question fully. And unfortunately, I can't answer Mr. Rallo's question because I'm busy trying to deal with this motion and to run the meeting. So that's my response. I see Councilmember Sims.
Thank you. I just want to say the normal course of business for standing committees is variable. But I agree with Councilmember Rallo, and I would ask you that can you articulate the questions that you're uncomfortable with so we could discuss that this evening? I think we're all here, all 9 of us, and you'll get full input. So, and I know you may not have it, you might be confused, but I would think tonight's a better use of our time. No one's rushing off, and I'd like to discuss it if there is some questions that appear to be concerning.
I'm going to do my best to put it together while I'm still fielding questions on the motion. It came late in the 20-question response. I remember thinking this is a significant question that would need further answering. I'm going to try to dig it up now while we speak. It might have involved staff needing to go back and get us more information. Off the top of my head, I can't remember it. I'm doing my best. So if I could pass the gavel, Mr. Sims, to you as Vice President, I could try to dig that question up while you take question of the motion from other members. Would you be willing to chair while I answer your question?
I would be. I would like to check with the parliamentarian to make sure is that proper? Don't know. Sure.
As far as I know, that's fine.
Thank you. I'm going to take a minute to try to answer your question.
Well, and don't we have a motion on the table as well?
We do. And your question is to the motion, and I'm trying to provide an answer to you, but I'm busy. So if you would be so kind as to take other responses from members while I try to answer your question, I would appreciate it.
Councilmember Flaherty.
Thank you.
I think you were next.
Is it appropriate to ask 2 questions of Mr. Wason that may bear on this motion? Is that okay? Okay, I'll just proceed.
I think it is. I'm looking at our parliamentarian. I would think all questions would go back to the author. But Mr. Wason, are you here? Yes.
The first question is, how would a 2-week postponement from today for final action affect this particular grant and project from Public Works perspective? And I'll let you answer that one first, and I'll ask a second.
So first, most importantly, we have to have this project awarded by August 1st. So that means we've been working since we found out about the grant, success of the grant, that we need to put together our bid documents, get the entire project ready for bid, put it out to bid, do the proper advertising, which I believe is 14 days, take in the bids, review the bids, and then award a bid by August 1st. If there's any delay to this, that'll be a very, very, very tight timeline, and we would have to have planning and transportation staff members reprioritize current projects they're probably working on to focus only on this bid package if we delayed 2 weeks or longer. I have tremendous concern about delaying anything here 2 weeks for that reason.
Okay, and this may bear on the second question, which is, if this were to go back to committee hearing next week, I think some council members, myself included, have expressed concern about the source of the grant matching funds proposed. And the question is, would the administration, yourself as Public Works, Mr. Underwood, entertain a negotiation or conversation in any form about the source of the match funds and considering other options, or no?
I won't speak for the mayor himself or the deputy mayor, but this is the most practical and available set of funding that we could use to move forward this project while leveraging $382,000 from the NDOT via grants. There are too many other variables that I'm not comfortable with, and knowing that we have this in the supply lines right now and it's available, this is my most comfortable suggestion to the council on how we move forward.
Okay.
Did you want to comment on that, Mr. Underwood?
Yes, any change to what the app board would start the process entirely over again,
Yes.
which includes the 10-day advertising process. So, if we came back 2 weeks later, we would just basically, we'd be 6 weeks. That would be a 6-week delay.
So the answer is no, functionally.
Yes.
Thank you.
That kills the project.
Thank you. Any further questions from council members? Okay, seeing none. Parliamentarian, are we back to the motion on the table?
Yes, I believe we need to go to the public. Mr. Lucas, is that right?
I'm sorry, you're absolutely correct. Public comment on this motion. Mr. Lucas, do we have anyone?
So this is public comment on the motion to send this appropriation ordinance back to the Transportation Committee.
Correct. I believe so. That's correct. Okay.
We do have one member of the public wanting to comment. Give me a second. Mr. Dave Askins should be unmuted and ready to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Askin. Your questions is?
Yes, a question related to President Volan's remark that he feared he would bore everyone to death by going into the procedural machinations, dividing the question versus the amendment. And I would like very much to be bored to death. And my question is, if you pass the amendment, that looks to me like it lops off the paving project and would make it disappear from existence. It would no longer be available for the council to act on after the amendment passes. You couldn't postpone it. You couldn't refer it to committee, as far as I understand it. So that's my question. And I think that there should be some clarity on the difference between dividing the question on the one hand and passing the amendment on the other, even if it does bore everyone to death. Thanks.
Councilmember Vola. You're muted.
Point of order. Are we back to council comment then, seeing no other public comment?
I believe Councilmember Volan has a response, but he's muted. Thank you.
Well, first of all, it's public comment. I can clarify what the member of the public said. There are actually three different actions that have been contemplated just this afternoon. One was the motion that I've made that's on the table. The second was to divide the question. The third was to hear the amendment as proposed by Councilmember Rosenbarger, which could have been achieved by dividing the question. It was a different way of approaching it. So I've made this motion first because I believe that it precedes. If we're going to commit, if we're going to send to committee, then we don't need to hear the amendment tonight because the committee will contemplate it there, make a recommendation. In other words, we'll take it up in 2 weeks, no matter whether we go back to committee or just go to third reading. But that the motion to send back to committee or to go to third reading, I believe preceded the question of the amendment, whether it was achieved by dividing the question or by amending the ordinance. And I think, as everyone can hear, there's enough confusion around what's appropriate.
Muted, but he's an asshole. Whoa.
Continue, Councilmember Volan.
Thank you. Well, that was refreshing. That it's appropriate to take more time. I mean, this is the problem we used to have with the committee of the whole in 2 weeks, that there's not enough time. I mean, the amendment was created and only circulated a day or two ago. We don't understand the full ramifications of it, although we've had questions answered tonight. I'm asking for more time, and that's why I thought that was more appropriate than going forward with the amendment tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Volan. I'm not so sure I'm comparing committee of the whole to standing committees is the point. I will defer to the parliamentarian with this question. When we're in public comment, does that include public questions that is obliged to be answered I thought it was just comments and not questions to be answered for public comment. Just seeking clarification.
That's true. It's up to the council then if they want to follow up. It's up to individual council members if they would like to follow up and get the questions answered.
Yes, during council comment period, but that's not where we are now. Are we still in there? Do we have any more anyone waiting in the public comment queue?
Another quick point of order. I think Mr. Wason previously had wanted to weigh in on the question. He had that opportunity in a sense in answering my questions, but he may have more specific things that he wanted to say.
And I would like to hear from him as well.
That opportunity.
Well, if it's okay, before we get there, do we have anyone else in the public comment queue?
No.
No. Are you ready, Mr. Wason?
Members of the council, and I say this with all respect, delaying this project 2 weeks could forego our ability to utilize these NDOT funds. If we don't have this project awarded by August 1st, we will be we forfeit the funding. I want to point out a few things here. We are requesting a transfer of funds from a fund that was underutilized through the winter months to leverage the NDOT community crossing grant. We are looking to maintain infrastructure that we have to maintain that is already built. I really thank Jeff McKim for his comments earlier. I think he hit the nail on the head here. This doesn't preclude us from committing anything in the future to this roadway. This does not preclude us from anything in the future of building new networks of bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. But when we have the opportunity to leverage funds that would take us, for a roadway project of this size and magnitude, I really strongly, I just very much would ask the council to consider that in their decisions this evening. I very much request that we move this forward this evening. I think we've answered the questions the best we can. I think we've provided the information we can. If anyone wants to sit down and go over paving lists year to year and why we make what decisions we make, we're more than happy to have that discussion. But I'm very fearful if we delay this 2 weeks or longer. And as Controller Underwood said, we'd have to re-advertise. It gives me great pause to think that we would delay this 2 weeks and potentially forego this funding source of outside funding. So I'll leave my comments at that. I would say, actually, I'll mention one other thing. When it comes to that committee structure and the Transportation Committee meeting, Councilmember Volan, you've mentioned a couple times, we didn't get any questions before that meeting. We didn't get, I don't think we followed the procedure that the council outlined when they thought about their committee structure. And so, we do our best to answer your questions as they come in and as quickly as we possibly can to make sure that the council's comfortable in the actions we're asking them to take. And I feel like we've done that. I feel like we've put our best effort forward here. And I would be completely remiss if we lost out on this opportunity to leverage these NDOT funds. I think that would be a mistake.
Okay, we're still in public comment, and I don't see anyone else on public comment. Are we prepared for council final comments on this motion? Councilmember Rallo.
Thank you. Well, I understand that there may be some questions remaining, but I think they could be articulated this evening. I think they come down to the source of the funding, and then the freedom to use it for other expenditures other than paving. It seems my interpretation is that this maintenance is required. It's needed. That this is a valuable opportunity because we can leverage other funds. Concerns about biking infrastructure can be attended to later because the paving will be done, and then we can look at at whether bike lanes can be put in. Tied to this is an enormous project that is a bike and pedestrian infrastructure project that staff has worked on for a couple of years, and that is the Sarah Road Side Path. That was initiated actually by Spicewood neighborhood who wanted a sidewalk, And then it was noted that on the sidewalk committee that that this was composed of a large missing gap between Rogers Road and Morris Pike of a side path that hadn't been built. And at the recommendation of a letter drafted by the sidewalk committee, council sidewalk committee, staff then went to the MPO. The MPO supported it. And I should add that the MPO has other competing infrastructure programs that are road related, but they put a lot of emphasis on getting funding for the Sarah Road side path, which we did. And so this matching fund is going to, essentially manifest in millions of dollars of bike and ped infrastructure. So I think that this is a very good package. I'm very appreciative of staff. I think that they've done a very good job in terms of balancing priorities. It's not one-sided whatsoever. And it still leaves the opportunity open to put biking infrastructure in. And I would hate to potentially lose this opportunity for leveraging funds, which we often don't get. So I would vote against, I would urge my colleagues to vote against this and vote this evening in the affirmative for this appropriation. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe Councilmember Sandberg was next, then Councilmember Flaherty, and then Councilmember Volan.
Yes, I do my due diligence between the time I see something coming forward and I have conversations with staff ahead of this meeting. I have no questions. I have no concerns for a lot of the great comments that were made about the validity of this project and our need to move forward tonight without further delay. So I will vote no on this, and I intend to vote yes on the project as a whole when it comes forward to a vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Flaherty.
I'm sorry if I raised my hand. I don't have a comment on this motion. Thank you.
Not a problem. Councilmember Volan.
So there's not a lot to respond to here, and I haven't had insufficient chance to do so. The first thing I want to say is that to call this a package is technically correct, but it's really 3 different projects, one of which is in dispute, the other 2 of which nobody wants to vote against. But because the administration packaged it as a single ordinance, I was not under the understanding that any change to the app board would require re-advertising. That's another fine point that I don't have time to investigate or get into tonight because the question is upon us. So the upshot of this is from now on, I'm going to question every ordinance that the administration brings forward to ask whether or not it should be multiple ordinances so that we can take up so that one will not be dependent on another. But I deferred to the administration who assured us that this would not be a controversial piece of legislation. And I think that they were, I'm sorry?
Continue, please.
I understand that they don't think that it was. I don't blame them for thinking that it was. It is up to us as the council to guard the prerogative of members to be able to make decisions like this when we have omnibus legislation, which some of us who are senior have complained about in the past, that we've had, ordinances that have 55 sections in them. They can get unwieldy. Well, here we have it. Combined with the fact that the administration asked us to expedite this, I now, and I believe it was a mistake to allow the advertising of the public meeting to be this, because it undercut the committee's opportunity to fully flesh this out. These questions would have been better answered. The amendment, and any amendments might have been better formed. And we need to jealously guard the ability of members to write amendments, whether we agree with them or not. Again, I was ambivalent last week, and I voted that way for a reason. I forget already what Mr. Wason said. There was something I wanted to respond to, but I haven't had the chance. This should just illustrate how frustrating it is for me to try to answer everybody's questions tonight when I can't. This is one reason why I'm asking that we go either back to committee or at least to a third reading if we don't go to committee. I am happy that some of my colleagues are satisfied that they have done the work, as they say. I've done the best I can, but sometimes we drop the ball. And again, there's a reason why the committee process allows for the second regular session after it's referred to committee. And if this doesn't illustrate it, I don't know what will. Finally, I guess to address Mr. Wason's concern about the iron being hot and we should strike, that is also a recipe for decide already and don't think too much about it. I know that they have done their due diligence. I am not blaming them for, the only thing that I'm unhappy about is that we were pushed to decide already, and we deferred, and now I think that's a mistake. And I have questions from now on about any app board if it requires re-advertising, because it undercuts the ability of the council to amend or to deliberate. So I would respectfully ask my colleagues to at least be willing to if this motion fails to refer to committee, which would then have to return by June 3rd, at least vote to postpone to a third reading on June 3rd. Thank you.
Councilmember Rosenberger.
Is this a period where we're just commenting on the
Final council comments? Yes, ma'am. On the motion.
On the motion to send it back to TC. Just a little, I just wanted to talk a little bit about like this narrative of urgency that's happening here. So right now we have 12 weeks to get this project awarded, which includes a bidding period that has to be 2 weeks long. And we're going to want to go over those proposals, right? And, well, Public Works, I guess. And mainly we have 12 weeks here. If we postpone this 2 weeks, we've got 10 weeks. And I think, it sounds like we could get everything done at time. So I think there's a sense of urgency that's a little bit based on not wanting to have this discussion. And I think we can get this job done in that period of time. So I don't think that should sway anyone out there. I mean, our job isn't to just approve anything that comes before us. It is to do our due diligence and really get in there and make sure we're asking the right questions and getting those questions answered. I think there's still, I would hope that there's an opportunity here to look at the source of funding. I think most of us here, if not all of us, are on board with this grant. I think it's awesome that we got it. This road needs to be repaved. I seriously question where we're pulling this money, and I would rather us just pull it from somewhere else. And I think having like a willingness to have that conversation would be good. Whether that happens tonight, whether that happens, before next week, I don't know. I can see a reason to have this committee meeting and talk about that. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not ready to do it as is right now. We're also going to talk about potentially dividing this up. I think ordinances to fund different projects should be separated in the future because they really are different discussions. So that's where I am right now.
Councilmember Scambaluri, did I see your hand up?
You did. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, where to begin here? There are a couple of points comments I've heard that trouble me a little bit. And one, perhaps it was unintentional, was the implication that anytime staff or administration alerts us to the time-sensitive nature of a proposal, it must be because they're pressuring us to get it done. And I think that is a mistaken assumption. Frankly, I think Mr. Wason and Mr. Crowley and the mayor are paid to alert us when things are time sensitive. So I cannot in good conscience ask our colleagues in the administration to let us know about the time sensitive nature of a project and then fault them when they do. That doesn't make sense. For the record, I was one of the people who supported the formation of committees back at the beginning of the year. My loyalty was never ever to the committee structure itself. It was never to the 2 weeks for the sake of 2 weeks or anything, or 2 hearings for the sake of 2 hearings. It was to make better legislation. So as I've listened to this conversation tonight, what I listened for is what will allow us to put forward the best legislation possible. What do we need to do that? And like several of my colleagues, Councilmember Rollo, Councilmember Sandberg, I have been listening for a compelling reason to send this back to committee or to delay it for a 3rd reading. And I haven't heard anything that will suggest if we just had this piece of information, we're going to get better legislation as a result. I haven't heard anything like that. And so I will not support a motion to send this back to committee or to delay until June 3rd. And I will see about the amendment that still remains on the table or in the background here. But I am also inclined to support this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, I've been thinking about, what could change if we send this back to the Transportation Committee, which I serve on. And as Councilmember Rosenbarger said, I think the key sticking point is from which fund to draw the matching dollars for the community crossings grant for College Mall Road. And it's my understanding from what Mr. Underwood said earlier that if we change the source of those funds, we have to start the clock back at 0 as far as public notice. And so that would set the project back more than just to June 3rd. It would delay it further than June 3rd. And I see that as problematic for the reasons that Mr. Wason indicated. If that wasn't the case about the starting over with public notice, I think I would be inclined to go to another hearing because I think this question of where the funds come from is a legitimate question, given our transportation plan's emphasis on bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure to be more important than automobile infrastructure. I mean, it basically says that in our transportation plan. But given the circumstances, I don't see any point in sending it back to the Transportation Committee.
A point of information, could Mr. Lucas or Mr. Underwood clarify the length of the public notice period for an appropriations ordinance were a different ordinance to be brought?
Oh,
the number of days.
What was your question?
If Mr. Underwood or Mr. Lucas could clarify the number of days required for the public notice period for an appropriations ordinance as a point of information. 10 days, thank you.
And then you have to add on when it has to go to the paper, so it's about 14 days.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I thought it was 14 days that I had heard first. Councilmember Smith.
We've talked a lot about all the things surrounding the project, and it seems that I'm going to agree with several of my colleagues that it doesn't appear that there's anything that would come forward that would significantly change what we need to do and how the general gist of this has to go with getting the funds together to do the paving. So I'm not going to be supporting the amendment, and I want to move us forward and complete what we need to do to get the project underway. The time-sensitive nature of it, if it wasn't time-sensitive, we could send it back to Transportation Committee, but it's getting a little bit close to that it may make us miss an opportunity to leverage that funding. So I'm going to be supporting the overall movement forward to get this paving done. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, any further council comments? Okay, I only see Councilmember Boland, but I will say that would be your second bite of the apple. So I'd like to stay in this first round, if that's okay.
Please.
My comment says, I don't see how another cycle would change anything on this project as far as getting it started and completed. There may be questions on certain funding sources. We do have Mr. Underwood here tonight, and I think this would have been the appropriate time for that. I was a little bit miffed to hear that the Transportation Committee felt pushed to bring it to council, or maybe that was just one person's comment, and maybe I hope I didn't mishear that. But that is under the control and purview, I think, of that council, of that committee. I do apologize. And as much as some would wish or prefer it not to be so, this project is sorely needed for traffic flow. And I think we can still do a lot of the things that we're talking about and want to at a later date. It is not prohibiting anything. And lastly, on the first round, I have to admit, I'm a little bit miffed on hearing that from this point forward, one of my colleagues plans to question every app order brought by the administration simply because there's a disagreement on our discussion this evening. That to me is counterproductive, and it's simply my comment, and it's not looking for further debate. However, we're into the second round, and Councilmember Boland, I do believe you had a comment.
Yes, as the maker of the motion, I believe that I have an obligation to respond to a couple of comments here because there are even now some misunderstandings, if nothing else, about council procedure. First of all, the committee did not have the option to keep this legislation because the advertised date for the app board was made for tonight instead of June 3rd. The committee, the council had an obligation to hear it tonight, whether the committee voted on it or not. So if the committee made no recommendation, it was going to be taken up tonight anyway because we advertised it. This is another reason why it should have been advertised for June 2nd. Now, here's the other problem. If the committee, if we had advertised it for June 3rd, rather, not 2nd, June 3rd, and the committee had decided after one meeting that they didn't need to meet a second time, well, then it comes back to council on May 20th, and that's not the advertised date. So there's a fundamental problem with the committee's ability to deliberate and the obligations to advertise an appropriation ordinance. It seems to me that what we need to do is advertise both potential meetings, May 20th and June 3rd, in order to make sure that the committee has the ability to deliberate as is contemplated under city code. So, and again, I don't want to relitigate committees here, but this is something, an unexpected problem that came out of, that we didn't see happening until an app board came forward. So to say that somehow it was under the committee's purview was not true, simply put. The committee had an obligation to vote last week, and this was the only way to send it back to committee. So let's clear that up. Secondly, with all due respect to my colleague, I don't think he's listening. I am talking about procedure. App ords are different than regular ords. They require advertising. We need to think differently about how they're done. The three projects here may be notionally related, but they have different use cases, different concerns. One of the three projects had a concern. It totally makes sense for the administration to package them as one. I get it. And I'm not trying to be threatening when I say that they should be divided up. I'm simply saying that this undermines the ability of the council to deliberate, period. For those people who believe that 1 2-week cycle is enough, it's no skin off their backs. But for people who believe that the council should have 2 cycles, it's a problem. And the fact that some members are not willing to defer to others, I mean, let's put this issue aside because, if Mr. Underwood is correct that this requires re-advertising, if there's any change to an app board, well, that really does hamstring the ability of council to change an app board, to contemplate an app board. It's either up or down. So we're forced to either approve it or disapprove it without any nuance, or it's going to delay the project, okay? I'm not comfortable with being told you've got to decide already, no matter what the circumstance. I have been willing and I have voted to expedite matters, as you can see from my record for the past few months. Okay, we have as a council voted to expedite matters, but the emergency is letting up enough that we can deliberate again. And the urgency here is not a COVID-19 emergency. It's Public Works is sweating the deadline, and they'd rather have the 2 extra weeks, but they still, as has been pointed out, would have 10 weeks left instead of 12 or whatever the amount is that they have to by August 1. So I believe there is time. I'm not going to get in the way of this project. I may vote no on the whole thing only because I wanted to vote no on a third of it. But again, dividing the question is complicated too. Dividing the question is not debatable. I only realized that today after consulting parliamentarily. So with all due respect to everyone who believes that the administration is doing good work, let me just say that I join you. I agree that they're doing good work, but that is not enough reason to dismiss a concern that any of us might have about an aspect of the legislation that they're bringing forward. Okay, it's not a vote on the worthiness of any person or any or the administration. This is the particular issue, and I would have appreciated an opportunity for better and deliberation, and that usually means longer. And in this case, it wasn't going to be any longer than a normal reference to committee. The committee abortively had to suspend their deliberation because of this misunderstanding about advertising an app work. So let's be very clear and narrow about the issues at hand here. With that, I yield. Thank you.
Councilmember Rollo.
Yeah, ordinarily I wouldn't respond, but I think it really bears on well, a couple things. One is that I didn't hear anyone dismiss concerns. I think everybody was weighing whether the concern was worthy of sending it back for another hearing under the circumstances of a timetable that's pending. So and that's why I wanted an articulation of what the concern was and whether, as Councilmember Piedmont Smith said, it could be addressed, whether we could resolve it by sending it back to another committee, and Councilmember Scrimbelluri said. But then the other point, Councilmember Volin, is that the council leadership decides scheduling and it decides the content of the legislation coming before us. You as president could have divided these topics, and it needn't have been an appropriation ordinance that came forward as an omnibus appropriation ordinance by the administration, but the administration surely got a signal from you that that was appropriate. So I don't see the administration really being at fault here. I think that they interpreted what the council's desire was as you directed as council president. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. We're in council comment period, and seeing no furthers, are we ready to vote on this motion? Is that proper, Councilmember Piedmont Smith? Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Call the question.
Clerk Bolden, can you please call the roll?
Yes.
Before you get started, and there's been a lot of discussion, are we all clear on what this motion is, which is to send it back to committee? Okay, thank you.
Okay, and this vote starts with Councilmember Volin.
Yes.
Piedmont Smith?
No.
Flaherty?
No.
Smith?
No.
Sandberg?
No.
Rollo?
No.
Scrimbelluri?
No.
Rosenbarger?
No.
And Sims?
No.
Thank you.
And that motion fails 1-8. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Flaherty.
When Council President Bolin has commented that a motion to divide the question, that is to consider different parts of the app board independently. He noted that discussions with council staff suggested that that was not debatable. Is it that the motion itself is not debatable, but if the motion passed, each part of the question that it's divided into would then be debatable, just like any normal portion of an ordinance? Is that correct? So it's just the motion itself that's not debatable. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Lucas?
Okay. Actually, I think our parliamentarian said yes.
Yes.
Unless Mr. Lucas is needed. So.
Thank you,
Okay.
Councilmember Piedmont-Smith. Thank you.
Mr. President, you now have the gavel back, and
thank you, sir.
Moving forward. Thank you.
Appreciate it. So we are now back to Appropriation Ordinance 2002. Mr. Flaherty.
I would like to move to divide the question on Appropriation Ordinance 2002. Specifically, that it be divided into two parts. The first part would include the appropriation from the LIT Special Distribution Fund, Fund number 157, the decrease in the appropriation in Classification 1, Personal Services, Classification 2, Supplies, and Classification 3, Services and Charges in the Motor Vehicle Highway Fund, Fund number 451, and the increase in the appropriation in the same classifications in the Restricted Motor Vehicle Highway Fund, Fund number 456. The second part that I'm proposing that we divide AppWord 2002 into, the second part would include the transfer within the Cumulative Capital Development Fund, Fund number 601, between Classification 2 Supplies and Classification 4 Capital Outlays. Also, in the event that one or another part, if we divide into two parts, fails to receive a majority vote, that staff would be instructed to reflect that and note that in the ordinance.
Councilmember Flaherty, will you please send that motion in writing to the clerk?
Yes, I will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Motion needs a second.
Second.
We have a motion and a second.
So
just to clarify, Mr. Lucas or Madam Parliamentarian, can we please clarify what is in order for this motion? Is it in fact not debatable?
According to my Robert's rules, it's not debatable.
I don't believe it is, no.
Okay.
And I do have.
It is amendable, though.
Mr. Lucas?
It is amendable.
I was simply going to note, I do have the division of the question in writing. If you give me a second, I can display it if needed, but I will provide that to the clerk. It essentially just removes the voting on the transfer within the Cumulative Capital Fund to its own question. But I can display that if anybody needs me to.
Does any member feel the need to have it displayed or to have it sent to them?
I just need it sent.
I sent it to you already, Clerk Bolden. It's in your email.
Thank you so much.
And would it be appropriate, while not debatable, would it be appropriate for me to explain or present the motion, explain why I'm bringing it? Or no?
I think not.
Okay.
Then I think we go, does everyone understand the question to divide Appropriation Ordinance 2002? Are there any questions about the motion? If not, we'll go to a roll call vote on the division of Appropriation Ordinance 2002. Will the clerk please read? Please call the roll.
Just a moment, please. Okay. Start with Councilmember Piedmont-Smith.
Yes.
Flaherty?
Yes.
Smith?
No.
Sandberg?
No.
Rallo?
No.
Scambalori?
No.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
No.
Thank you. Rosenbarger,
Yes.
Sims,
No.
Volin,
Yes. Motion fails 4-5. Are there any further motions on appropriation ordinance 2002? Councilmember Rosenbarger?
No, I just, sorry, thank you. I just want to say I'm not bringing my amendment based on the discussion that we've had tonight.
Thank you. Are there any other amendments or motions on the proposal? If not, I think we may need to go back to the public for one more round. Is there any member of the public who would like to address appropriation ordinance 2002? Please speak now. Please raise your hand or speak up in the chat. Mr. Lucas, do you see anybody who wants to speak to this? All right, back to the council for debate. Final comment on appropriation ordinance 2002. Councilmember Rallo.
Just to reiterate again, that's, well, first of all, that the side path project is very significant for that area of the community. The Spicewood neighborhood, Hyde Park Village, it connects them with a neighborhood activity center that is Renwick. It connects them with a regional activity center that is the College Mall area. And previous to that, they didn't have very good connection. And so it forced people into their cars, essentially, in order to get up to a movie theater or to get to a restaurant at a neighborhood activity center that was only a quarter or half a mile away. So that project is very, very significant. And I just wanted to give credit to the former Council Sidewalk Committee, Councilmember Sims, Councilmember Sturbaum, Councilmember Granger, who saw this as a priority. And as a member myself, and we pursued, we put the case to staff. Mr. Copper and Scott Robinson went forward with an appeal to the MPO. The MPO supported it. We got state funding for it. And so we didn't have to do it in piecemeal. We're going to have this tremendous connection that goes now from, as I said, Rogers all the way up to the stadium. Now, if you go north of Morris Pike, you encounter sidewalks, which is problematic if you're on a bicycle and there are pedestrians. So for good reason, I think it's a very good idea to pursue bike infrastructure. And knowing that this maintenance project of repaving is not going to preclude that is a very important aspect, I think, going forward, that we can continue pursuing that bicycle infrastructure. I also wanted to thank John Kennedy. I think he was here earlier this evening. Maybe he wanted to speak on this because as president of Spicewood, he was key in advocating for it and coming to meetings and so forth. So I'm excited about this project, and I appreciate staff finding matching funds, which is probably going to become rare in the future, and it's very important that we take advantage of these opportunities. So I'll be supporting it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Rallo. Further debate. Anybody else would like to speak to App Board 2002? Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, thank you. I want to thank the members of the administration who worked on this, Mr. Underwood, Mr. Wason, Mr. Copper, and others. And I'm very pleased that we have grant funds to work with, both for the College Mall Road paving, and I've already lost sight of it, but I think the other one, yes. Well, the other one was for the Now I've lost it. Oh yeah, the Sarah Road improvements, as Mr. Aller just mentioned. Sorry, it's been a long evening. So yes, I'm very grateful that we got these grants, and I think they're going to be put to good use. I do want to make a few comments. First, I want to read from our transportation plan, just so that we, and when I say we, I mean council and administration, keep these in mind as we move forward with our transportation planning. So I quote, "As Bloomington has limited right-of-way for new or expanded transportation infrastructure, the city must consider the needs of all travelers in various types of environments as it retrofits existing facilities. The city of Bloomington must carefully consider its space, funding, and time to prioritize infrastructure for people who take the bus, bicycle, or walk for transportation." So this is really essential as we move forward. It's great that, you know, the state does give grants, but unfortunately a lot of them are just for car-centered transportation. But as we find matching funds for those grants, we should consider which funds, you know, are priorities as a city. And right now, those priorities do not look like they are balanced towards what we say in our transportation plan, and what we say in our comprehensive plan is a focus on non-vehicular transportation. So the funding, as we have reviewed this evening, just for repaving is over $2 million. That's not including these grants. And the accumulated budget for sidewalks is $1.3 million. So there's definitely a disconnect here between what our plans say we prioritize and what our community has said it wants to prioritize, and what the dollars are in our budgets. And that's a concern to me. Now, as to the specific appropriation ordinance, because the source of funding cannot be changed without resetting the clock on the public notice period, and resetting the clock on the public notice period could jeopardize our use of the Community Crossroads grant from the state of Indiana. I am going to accept that we're going to be using cumulative capital development funds for the match, rather than using funds from the repaving budget. I understand what Mr. McKim and Mr. Underwood and others have said about making sure what we already have as infrastructure is maintained. On the other hand, we have a limited amount of money, and I also give kudos to whoever it was, I don't remember who it was, who said, you know, you don't have complaints about the maintenance of side paths or bike lanes because you don't have the side paths or bike lanes in most of the city. So I think that we need to find a new balance. And that balance, you know, I don't even think balance is the right word, because if we're looking at pedestrian bike infrastructure versus automobile infrastructure, our plans all say that there's no balance. We need to prioritize bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. And, you know, if drivers are complaining about potholes and stuff, well, they participated in our planning processes. They had every opportunity to participate. And I don't want to say let's leave all the potholes, but I'm saying we need to do better than balance, because for decades the emphasis has been on cars, and we need to change that emphasis. In a way, that's all tangential to this particular app org, because in the first case we are just moving money around for the motor vehicle highway fund. Then we are using money from a lit special distribution fund that can only be used on roads. And then the contentious one is the use of the cumulative capital development fund to match the grant for College Mall Road, which I've already explained I'm going to support because I don't want to lose that grant money. But I think this has been a good opportunity to realize how far we still need to go to really live up to our plans to emphasize bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. And I recognize, as Mr. Rallo said, we have part of this is going to be a side path, which is wonderful. But I also would like to have a meeting with Mr. Wason and just understand why the turning radii proposed at the Morris Pike intersection are still pretty wide. Because that intersection has been terrible for pedestrians and bicyclists for decades. And if we now have a chance to fix it, let's fix it right. So I'd like to, have a crash course from the engineers and see if we can't tighten those up. Sorry, I'm kind of rambling. I'm going to support this, but I think it was a good opportunity to remind ourselves we need to live up to our promises and our plans. Thank you.
Councilmember Flaherty.
Yes, first, want to express my thanks to members of the city staff from various departments who have put time and energy into their thoughtful responses to questions from council members. I truly do appreciate their insights and their hard work. I also will express that I wish we could have considered these questions separately, either in separate ordinances, or if the motion to consider each question separately would have passed. If you were in favor of all portions of it, you could have just voted yes on everything, of course. But I'm stuck in the situation where I don't support a portion of this. And now I have to decide how to vote when I do support some and not others because it's a package. I am in support of the transfer of funds for the restricted motor vehicle highway fund per state guidance, as well as the appropriation of the special lit distribution for the Sarah Road multi-use path and intersection improvements. I have reservations, however, about the appropriation of the cumulative capital development funds to match the community crossings grant that we were awarded for the College Mall Road repaving project. In part, this reservation is because our transportation plan calls for protected bike lanes on that road, and we haven't taken meaningful steps toward that. But the other reservation is that the source of the money for the match of the grant, as has been discussed. And while I fully support using the grant and repaving this street, I think the source really matters. This grant is for a repaving project, and I think the matching funds should come from the paving budget. If the grant wasn't awarded at all, the full cost of the project, $700,000, would be coming entirely from the paving budget next year. It's terrific that we were awarded the grant, of course, and I'm all for using it and leveraging state dollars. But to me, as a logical matter, if it was all going to come from the repaving budget, why shouldn't the match portion also come from the repaving budget, since this is a repaving project? It's still good that we, and even if we were to match the grant with funds from the paving budget, that is still a win for the Streets Division paving budget overall. It saves them $300,000 thanks to the grant. So I don't know why we can't accept that win for the paving budget and leave it at that, but instead choose to use this other money that is something of a windfall thanks to a mild winter, and use it for more repaving to augment the paving budget essentially to a level of 2.7 million when that is not what we budgeted for 2020. So we're saying here's discretionary money. We're going to prioritize a car-centric approach. And that to me is really the sticking point, the opportunity cost of that $386,000. When we all know that money for sidewalk repair and construction and our bicycle network is really hard to come by. We talk about it all the time, how massive that funding gap is and how tough it is to build that network, which, by the way, requires substantially lower maintenance than roadways. But it's really important that we start working on changing all of that for reasons of social equity, public health, climate change mitigation, reduced air pollution, economic development that comes from complete streets, quality of life, and most importantly, the safety of our streets for the most vulnerable users, pedestrians and cyclists, who continue to die in our streets in part due to design. That happens. It's true everywhere. It's true here. We have to start changing our transportation system, as our transportation plan and comprehensive plan and sustainability action plan all call for, and finding the money to do that is hard, but here is some that could have been available. We could use it to prioritize pedestrians within our transportation system, which again, all of our city plans and goals say we should do. So in sum, I fully support using the community crossings grant for repaving College Mall Road. I accept that that should be done and can be done, but I don't support the proposed funding source. for the matching of funds for the grant due to the opportunity cost of that approach. Rather, I think the matching funds should have come from the budgeted repaving dollars. I've come to this conclusion based on our plans and the goals in those plans. And for that reason, I'll be voting no on the ordinance as a whole because I don't have an option to only vote no on this portion. On the matter of timing, if this ordinance were to fail, or if that portion of the ordinance were to fail, had we been able to consider that question, I think it's pretty clear what the alternative funding source would have been. And within 14 days, we could have been back for final action on an appropriations ordinance that used paving dollars for this repaving grant matching. So I don't think the possibility was precluded by the timing. Finally, I'll note that I certainly respect those in the administration who may have a different opinion on this than I do, and I do thank them for their recommendation, but I respectfully disagree in this case. Thank you again also for their time and input to our questions. And I would also welcome, as Councilmember Piedmont-Smith noted, further conversation with the administration on these matters. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Any further comments? Councilmember Rosenbarger.
I want to keep it short because we've been here a long time. Thanks to city staff for being here tonight, being at Transportation Committee and answering questions from the get-go on this. I know I kind of started bombarding staff with questions after we first heard this in our work session. So thanks. I know it's taken a long time, a lot of phone calls, and I appreciate all of that. I want to echo Councilmember Piedmont-Smith's comments. I think she said everything very well, and I agree with that. And I don't want to repeat what she said. As I've said, I think this grant is great. This is a great opportunity. I'm glad we get it. I know we applied for these and don't always get them, so it can be very hit or miss, and it's great to get something so substantial. I just, as I have said, disagree with where the funding is coming from and think it should be coming from our paving budget. You know, we don't fund bike and ped equally to roads. If we're talking about balance, if we're talking about equity, if we're talking about equality, I mean, any way you slice it, right? We're millions behind in that, but our comp plan and our transportation plan says we've got to be prioritizing this. And I think this was a good conversation tonight. And I think it's about having these conversations, right? Thinking about doing things in different ways, not just doing them how we've always done them, and really gearing up for our climate action and equity that we talk so much about forwarding, right? I said it in the budget advance and at Transportation Committee last week, but I think we've got to really think bigger even than just budgeting for these things. We got to look at TIF dollars, we've got to look at bonding. And we have these plans that can guide us, right? We have a multimodal network list in our transportation plan. We've got a bike network priority list in our transportation plan. And I'm looking forward to having these conversations with experts and city staff about what should this build out look like, right? And like, how do we begin to incorporate thinking about bike ped into the beginning stages of our grant writing and of our projects, and just really incorporating it into ways that we haven't necessarily done in the past, but really getting in there and starting at the start. I just said it twice. So I still feel the same way about this ordinance as how I voted in Transportation Committee. I am totally on board with the Sarah Road project and funding that as is. I don't agree with the funding source for the community crossings matching grant. And so for that reason, I will still vote no on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Further council debate. Anybody else like to speak to the issue? I will take my opportunity then. I continue to be mystified at the focus that some people have on my advocacy for committees, for the committee process. I'm not doing it for its own sake. I'm doing it for precisely problems like happened tonight. The minority who voted to divide the question, in favor of dividing the question, didn't want to tell the majority what to do. They just wanted an opportunity, or rather to vote to send back to committee. Actually, I was the only minority who went back to committee, but there were people who supported it before it was obvious it was going to fail. wanted to do so that they could get it to a point where they could also vote for it. But that's not really the problem I have with tonight's activities. The problem I have is with the vote to divide the question. 5 members not only disagreed with sending it back to committee, they did not even allow obvious members of the minority to vote, express their opposition to one portion of it. They have forced the minority to vote all or nothing. And it was, as Mr. Flaherty said, there would have been no harm to allowing members to vote against the College Mall Road portion if they saw fit. It was likely also to pass. It was obvious it was going to pass. So the fact that the majority did not even allow the minority a chance to vote their conscience and put us in the position of having to vote up or down, all or nothing, I think is something that should really give them pause. It's greatly disappointing on, like it just didn't have to be that way. I will reiterate that the Sayre Road portion, unobjectionable. I support it. The Motor Vehicle Highway Restricted Fund, not a problem. I had concerns. I didn't even want to vote against the College Mall Road thing. I think we were on our way to having our questions answered. But, again, the committee process was cut short, not, we've been down that already. The irony of the statement about good road maintenance is that bicycle and pedestrian paths need very little maintenance, that bicycles and pedestrians put almost no wear on paved roads, that we're also having to commit a lot of money to repaving simply because cars are hard on streets. There's exponentially less impact by pedestrians and bicyclists on those same streets. I welcome the possibility that a bike path will be put on College Mall Road that isn't protected, as would be the one on 3rd Street that INDOT's installing. And I think that's great. And I hope someday we'll have protected bike paths there when we can figure out the geometry. I do think that College Mall Road lanes are too wide and they encourage speeding. And that they could be narrowed to get, the very idea that we can get an unprotected path at all is a sign that there's room to work with. I don't dispute Mr. Copper's assertion that there's not enough room to put a protected bike path as it is, and we have to think hard about redesigning it. And tonight was not the night to redesign College Mall Road, but I don't think we were trying to do that. Again, I would urge every member to consider that it does you no harm to allow another member to vote their conscience, especially if you know you're in the majority. But also I'll finally say that, I am culpable for the way that this was scheduled. And yes, I allowed the advertising to happen on the 20th. I'm not going to let it happen again, not under my watch. From now on, I'm going to scrutinize every app board and I'm going to ask, does this have to all be in one app board? Because if it undermines any member of the minority's ability to vote against one portion without having to also oppose things that they support, that's something that is simply procedural, doesn't have to happen. We can and should allow members to vote, to divide questions and vote on specific things. And combined with the complexities of having to advertise any change to an app board, it gives us all the more reason to have app boards come together as a package of several ordinances and not as one big one, for this very reason what happened tonight. With that, simply because of procedural issues, I have to vote no on this, but I want it to be very clear that I could have and would have supported the 2 of the 3, and I didn't even want to oppose the 3rd. But we have to do better procedurally. I'm going to work earnestly to make sure that questions are set up better so that any member who feels that they have to oppose some part will have that opportunity without having to oppose parts that they don't. With that, if there's no other debate, anyone else who'd like to speak, we have a second round. Then we will go to a vote. Will the clerk please call the roll on Appropriation Ordinance 2002?
Councilmember Flaherty,
No.
Smith,
Yes.
Sandberg,
Yes.
Rala,
Yes.
Scambolari,
Yes.
Rosenbarger,
No.
Sims,
Yes.
Volin,
No.
and Piedmont Smith.
Yes.
Okay.
The vote is 6-3 in favor. Appropriation Ordinance 2002 is adopted. We now go to legislation for first reading. We have none. Next is additional public comment. If there's any member of the public who'd like to speak on an item that was not the subject, not on tonight's agenda, please use the raise hand function in Zoom or type into the chat and Mr. Lucas will acknowledge you. Is there anyone who would like to speak to an item that was not on tonight's agenda? Seeing none, we'll go now to matters of council's schedule. Mr. Lucas, what do we have to be concerned about?
Sure. I wanted to ask the council if it wanted to consider scheduling a special session for next week. On our annual schedule, we have a committee week scheduled, but given that no new legislation was brought forward tonight, it's an opportunity to get some other things done. One thing that could occur next week is introduction of an ordinance aligning city-initiated towing fees with the private tow ordinance fees that you all took up at the beginning of this year. So that ordinance could be ready for introduction and possible discussion next week. You don't have to decide this tonight. There's a work session this Friday that's another opportunity to talk about council schedule, but scheduling a special session would give you all the ability to get some more work done, to work ahead. We're approaching summer recess and there's a few things left before we break. So
I want to thank you, Mr. Lucas. I want to encourage members to schedule a special session in case we can bring things forward. Again, to expedite matters. If we decide by Friday that we don't need the session, we can always cancel it. But if we don't schedule it now, we can't schedule it later. Can I get a vote of hands of who would like to schedule a special session? Is there a question?
Well, I wanted to make a motion to schedule a special session next Wednesday, May 27th at 6:30.
Second.
We have a motion, a second. Is there any discussion?
Well, just before you vote, it gets a little more complicated if you'd like to both introduce and discuss an item at the meeting next week. Typically, at first introduction, an ordinance would be referred to whatever committee, committee of the whole or a standing committee. And without you all having seen what might come forward next week, asking you what committee meetings you might want to schedule immediately after that special session seems a little premature. So maybe I can ask if members will be attending the work session this Friday, which I can talk about here in a second, in case we need to make another scheduling decision.
Let me suggest
there's a motion on the table.
There's not only a motion on the table, but that the question of whether to schedule a committee meeting can in fact wait until after this motion is done at the very least. Is there any other discussion about the motion to schedule a special session for May 27th? If not, will the clerk please call the roll on the motion?
Yes, Councilmember Smith,
Yes.
Sandberg,
Yes.
Rala,
Yes.
Scambolari,
Yes.
Rosenbarger,
Yes.
Sims,
Yes.
Volin,
Yes.
Piedmont Smith,
Yes.
and Flaherty.
Yes.
Okay, we'll schedule a special session for the 27th. Mr. Lucas, so you're concerned about having a committee that night. Can it wait until Friday?
It certainly can if a majority of the members here are going to be attending the work session. That would be another public opportunity, another public meeting for members to schedule meetings.
Can I get a show of hands of who can attend a work session Friday at noon? Please raise your hand. I see everyone raising their hand. I'm very encouraged that we will have that work session Friday at noon. And I believe there's an admin committee meeting immediately following at 1 o'clock to discuss personnel matters. So with that, does that satisfy your concerns, Mr. Lucas, about the committee?
I think that's fine for me, yes.
We can decide on Friday whether or not to have a committee meeting that night, or whether in fact to schedule any legislation for first reading at that special session. Are there any other council schedule matters, Mr. Lucas?
Just a few reminders. There is a Jack Hopkins Social Services Funding Committee meeting tomorrow night. The committee will be meeting to discuss funding recommendations. So that's a public meeting. Folks can find information on the Jack Hopkins portion of the website, and look forward to discussing that. I mentioned the work session on Friday, and Councilmember Volin mentioned the administration committee meeting that's immediately following that. So those are the rest of the meetings for this week, and we'll talk further on Friday about next week.
Thank you. Any other concerns or announcements? If not, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in favor, say aye.
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 We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone, and good evening.